Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Dirk Smillie.
Beth, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. It is a huge treat to come down here again. This is actually my second time to Daniel Island. I was here a few years ago doing research for this book, and spent some time with a couple of folks that you mentioned, Beth, Peter Lawson Johnson II, Peter L.J., and also his father. I drove around with Peter Pete Jr. around Daniel Island to kind of get a sense of the development here, which is absolutely amazing to see. And then spent some time with Peter Lawson Johnson up in Cane Hoy, which is Harry's hunting lodge, part of his retreat. I have to say, I think Harry Guggenheim would be very pleased to see what's gone on here, the build out of Daniel Island, which just a couple of decades ago was literally nothing but marshland, beautiful low country marshland, but uninhabited. So, and I say that because Harry himself actually once built a community many years ago. It was not in South Carolina, it was actually in South America. And this is when the Guggenheim family was involved in their mining operations all over the world. Harry was in his 20s at the time, and he was sent down by his brothers and his father. His brothers and his fathers basically operated Guggenheim Brothers, which was the mining outfit. And so they sent Harry down to the northern Chilean desert, actually the Atacama Desert, which is one of the driest places on earth. I don't think there had been rainfall there for at least 100 years. So it was a desolate, very difficult place to work. And Harry and his brothers brought in everything, water, power, and of course they needed a mining town for the 10,000 or so miners that would be working on this mine. So Harry built this town, and so he knew something about building communities. He unfortunately did not control much of what was going on outside of this town, which involved things like knife fights and gunfights and prostitution and gambling. I know that sounds like a typical day on Daniel Island. For Harry, it was a lot of trouble, but he managed through it pretty well. And I think he'd be pleased to see the quality of life that has been brought to Daniel Island through the creation of this community here. Mining was the way that the Guggenheims amassed their wealth. And they had, as I mentioned, mining operations down in South America, but they mined gold in the Yukon, they mined silver and copper in the American West, they were mining tin down in Bolivia, but copper was their most lucrative metal because, think about the timing, the middle, or the turn of the century basically, the middle of the Second Industrial Revolution, when copper was kind of the it metal. People were having telephones in their homes, and electricity was basically being wired everywhere. All of this ran on copper wires. And of course, there was a lot of appliances that ran on copper. So the Guggenheims were in a very good business with virtually unlimited demand. And the wealth that produced for them was extraordinary. So I mention all this because this is sort of the background of how Harry grew up. He grew up with this immense wealth. Here is a photo, by the way, if this is working, yes. This is a photo of Harry a little bit later in life, in his 40s, when he was basically running Guggenheim Brothers. But to give you a sense of the wealth of his own parents, Daniel appeared every year on the Forbes 400 rich list. He was sort of in the top 10 or 15 year after year, as were many of his brothers. Daniel and Florence, Harry's parents, bought a home on the north shore of Long Island that they called Hempstead House, and then right next to Hempstead House was Castle Gould, named after a railroad baron that Harry's parents had bought this from. But this was basically, if you can imagine, a castle that was modeled after Kilkenny Castle in Ireland, except that this castle that the Guggenheims lived in was 4 times bigger than that castle. And it had a moat, it had a drawbridge, of course, but and the groundskeeping staff required to maintain the castle and Hampstead House, the main residence, it's about 40 rooms, was about 200 people each year. So having grown up in that kind of wealth was probably a very heady experience, but this all changed in 1929 with the stock market crash. The Guggenheims, being in the mining business, had a lot of mining stocks that some of which completely lost their value. So the Guggenheim wealth took a hit to the extent of maybe losing a third of the entire wealth of the family in 1929. And then 1930, Daniel died, Harry's father. So things changed very much for Harry. At that point, Harry was old enough to kind of be the next family heir, the next family patriarch. And this is one of the reasons that I was interested in Harry's story, because he was put in a position where he had to sort of carry the torch from the old generation to the new generation of Guggenheims. The mining business was going into a decline somewhat even before the stock market collapse. And at that point in history, Harry kind of presided over a family business where the Guggenheims became known more for spending money than making it, as they got into various charitable endeavors and started to get into some businesses that the family had never been into, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. I wanted to take a moment, though, to take a step back and take a look at some of the visitors that Beth mentioned that have come to King Hoy over the years, because to do a biography, you have to know who that person's social influences were, who they spent time with, who their friends were. And at one point, Peter Wilson Johnson gave me the guest book at King Hoy to take a look at. So I pulled a few names that I thought you might be interested in. Beth, you mentioned a few of them, but one very frequent visitor to King Hoy and Daniel Island was Harry F. Byrd, who was the governor of Virginia and a U.S. Senator from Virginia. Robert Moses. Robert Moses was the Parks Commissioner in New York City, and probably the most powerful unelected person in New York City. Robert Carroll wrote his famous book, The Power Broker, about Robert Moses. And so Moses and his wife came at least a couple of times to King Hoy to visit Harry. Also, H.L. Stoddard. H.L. Stoddard was a conservationist who helped to actually create the profession of wildlife management. He was a close friend of Harry's and enjoyed King Hoy very much. Also, Anissa McMain. Anissa McMain was probably the most celebrated graphic artist of the time, this being late 1920s, early 1930s. And she did a lot of the pretty girl covers for Collier's and McCall's. Anissa McMain actually did the first image of Betty Crocker. And she was a kind of a semi-member of the Algonquin Round Table. So she knew a lot of celebrities and stars, playwrights of the day. Very interesting character who probably deserves her own book. But Anissa McMain came to King Hoy on a couple of occasions. Also, a lot of Navy brass. There was a Navy Admiral named John Price, who was a regular visitor to King Hoy and Daniel Island. John Price actually commanded all of the air forces within the Navy after World War II. Also, Hoyt Vandenberg. Hoyt Vandenberg was a U.S. Air Force general who had been director of the CIA. He's got a Air Force base named after him in California that's very famous. And I could name so many more people, but the one person who is probably the most famous, you may know the name Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh came to Cainhoy, I believe it was in the early 50s, probably about 1953, for a visit with Harry, and he took a boat with Harry down into Daniel Island, spent a few days fishing down here, and loved it. Lindbergh shared a lot of things in common with Harry, but hunting and fishing in particular were the two things that they really enjoyed with each other. Harry first met Lindbergh in 1927, and by the way, this is Harry's home on the North Shore of Long Island. It's called Falaise, and it looks very grand. It's a 26-room, sort of modeled after a 13th century manor house in England, and but it is actually very small compared to the parents' larger house that I was describing earlier. Falaise is on 90 acres, overlooking Long Island Sound. And as a matter of fact, Falaise is a museum today, and definitely worth a visit if you're ever in Long Island. It's arranged, set up exactly the way it was when Harry was living there. Down to, you can go up into Harry's bedroom, and the closet is open, and you can see his military uniforms, and you can go to the Lindbergh bedroom where Charles Lindbergh spent time writing his biography about his famous flight from New York to Paris. Anyways, all kinds of very interesting bits of history in that house, and I've loved it so much I've taken 3 tours. I would go back again. But anyway, so back to Lindbergh. Harry first met Lindbergh in 1927, a few days before his famous flight from New York to Paris. He had heard about Lindbergh trying to make this flight because there was a contest going on at the time. A Paris hotel mogul had offered $25,000 to anybody who could make a nonstop flight from New York to Paris. And several people had died trying to do this. A lot of the competitors were 2-person teams with multi-engine aircraft. Lindbergh was going to try this with a single motor monoplane and solo. So Harry was very interested in Lindbergh's gambit, and Lindbergh was actually just south of Falaise on an airstrip in Long Island. And so, in any case, Harry came down to see Lindbergh. He met him for the first time, as I said, 2 days before Lindbergh's flight, and he really didn't give Lindbergh much chance of making it. And that's because when he looked inside the cockpit, everything had been taken out to make room for, to essentially lighten the aircraft's load to make room for the amount of gasoline that would be required for that trip. About 3,600 miles from New York to Paris. And so Lindbergh had taken everything out of the cockpit, including the windshield. There's no windshield in the plane. It sounds crazy, but Lindbergh's idea was that if you're flying and you don't have a windshield, you can sort of yaw the plane one direction or the other and kind of get, for a few seconds, sort of see the visibility in front of the plane. He also had this device that was like a periscope, sort of a lateral periscope that went out the side of the plane with a mirror at the end of it, and he could look at that and see the front of the plane that way. He didn't have a windshield because he needed the space in the plane for the fuel. And so that was a bit harrowing just to look at, even without taking off. Lindbergh had taken some of these wicker chair, sort of a patio chair, and then jerry-rigged it into the bottom of the plane, wicker being so light. And so Harry just looked at this whole thing and just thought, this is not looking too good. So, but as you know, Lindbergh took off, he made the flight, he succeeded. When he came back, he was literally overnight become the most famous man in the world. And Harry, when he met Lindbergh, he said, when you come back, look me up. And so that is what Lindbergh did. And I don't know, they seemed to have hit it off right away. They were both very cerebral in nature. They were both basically quiet people. They both were meticulous planners. And they both, they both Republicans, and they both cared passionately about aviation. And so Lindbergh knew that at the time that he came back from his flight, Harry had recently set up an aviation fund because he was deeply concerned about the lack of progress in commercial aviation in the United States in the late 20s. Europeans were flying passenger planes all over the place, but the US, for some reason, was lagging behind. And so Harry shared that concern with Lindbergh. And I think their personal chemistry led to Lindbergh's work with Harry Guggenheim's fund. I won't. It's a long list of initiatives and things that this fund did, which are really almost unbelievable. But one of the most successful things that the fund did is Lindbergh's. It's labeled here Goodwill Tour. It was really like a reliability tour. The idea was that Lindbergh would take off and land in 82 cities across 48 states. This was just a few weeks after his flight to Paris and New York, so there was still a huge amount of interest in what Lindbergh had done. But Harry's idea was that if Charles Lindbergh is taking off and landing every day at precisely the same time, 2 o'clock, and that would be followed by a tour, say a parade, maybe some speeches, and then he'd get back on the next day and take off and land in the next city at exactly the same time. That said a lot about an airplane's reliability and its ability to keep to a timetable. And I think what Harry and what Lindbergh certainly recognized was at that time, changing the psychology about aviation was really required to help advance the sector itself. Because, you know, in those days, it's hard to imagine, but most people never actually seen an airplane in person. They might have seen illustrations or photographs, but to have Lindbergh actually show up in your town in his plane, take off, land and take off reliably and on time was really something to see. So the Goodwill Tour was one initiative that Harry had did with Lindbergh. This is a photo of Harry and Lindbergh getting out of a test flight of a plane that was making the rounds on a Los Angeles to San Francisco route. This was part of the kind of microfinance initiative that Harry had started. This is basically small business loans, small loans to mom and pop airline operators. And so the guy who was running this airline, Pop Hanshoe was his name, had a successful mail route, but he wasn't taking any passengers on at that point. So Harry made an equipment loan to him, which helped him basically begin these trial flights between LA and San Francisco. And there were quite a lot of other things involved, including a kind of a small weather service along the way, which Harry also bankrolled. But it was initiatives like that helped to get small-scale routes off the ground, so to speak, in aviation. So microfinance, public-private partnerships was another thing that Harry was involved with. He worked closely with the Hoover administration and the Coolidge administration before that on a whole series of initiatives. But I think the main initiative that Harry developed was a kind of university-based education and R&D. And so that was like Guggenheim aviation programs being set up at Stanford and MIT. First one was at NYU, University of Washington, Georgia Tech. Altogether, I think there were about 12 universities that wound up with Guggenheim aviation programs. A lot of these universities, through Harry's funding, were able to build wind tunnels. A wind tunnel is a very expensive thing, was a very expensive thing to build back in those days. But if you're going to develop propeller design or wing design, it's like you had to have a wind tunnel to do it. So that was one feature of a lot of these schools. There were a few other initiatives which were pretty interesting of the Guggenheim Aviation Fund. One of them was the development of blind flight. Harry managed to get Jimmy Doolittle as his test pilot to work on this project. Jimmy Doolittle was probably the most talented pilot in America at that time, late 1920s, early 30s. And the idea was to enable an airplane to be able to take off and land without any visual cues. So he got Doolittle and Elmer Sperry and some other folks, instrument makers, to work together and to develop what really was the earliest beginnings of the artificial horizon. And so that and a couple other gauges that you can sort of make out here in the cockpit was what Doolittle used to perform the first ever blind flight in aviation history. And so that was a breakthrough and something that really, as if the fund wasn't on the map already, it really made everybody aware how important the Guggenheim Fund was. Let's see, okay, so the fund only lasted about 5 years, and that was by design. Harry thought that he should create a kind of a financial mechanism that would have spark plugs, would be catalysts, sort of force multipliers to try to help aviation get off the ground. But he never intended it to last more than about 4 or 5 years, and so the fund was closed in 5 years. I think there's a couple of quick measures I would just mention in terms of actual impact on aviation at the time, because obviously there were many other players in aviation. There were many people who were investing in aviation, but by about the late 1950s, majority of aviation engineers had graduated from the Guggenheim aviation schools or Guggenheim programs. Most of these programs are still around, by the way. In fact, I think all of them are still in operation, with the exception of the NYU program. But in any case, the university approached that part of the aviation fund's strategy, I think by any measure, was very successful. And a little bit later on, this was in the early 1990s, I came across a study I'd never heard of. It was done by 3 Harvard researchers. One of them was the former dean of the Harvard Business School. They did a study of leadership in the air age, and their finding was that Harry Guggenheim probably had a bigger impact on the development of aviation in the US than the Wright brothers. And that might sound sort of impossible on its face, given the Wright brothers invented the airplane, but the Wright brothers, having invented the airplane, did everything they could to try to protect their patents and their designs, and that slowed down the rollout of aviation. To some degree, there were other factors, of course, but in any case, that was another measure, I think, of Harry's impact on aviation, which was pretty profound. So after the fund closed, Harry started talking to Lindbergh about, well, what's next? You know, what would be a worthy project or sector to fund. They had had so much success with aviation. I think he was kind of excited about the success of it, and was looking for someplace else or someone else to fund. And their answer was this gentleman, Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard was conducting rocket tests out of his, basically his aunt's farm, his cabbage farm in Massachusetts. And Goddard was, I mean, there were not many people that were actually experimenting in rocket research, or much less, you know, firing test rockets. But Harry and Lindbergh had read about Goddard in a Times story one day, and so Harry had actually just been named ambassador to Cuba, so he was about to leave the country for some amount of time, and he asked Lindbergh to go check out Goddard, and Lindbergh thought that Goddard's work was sound. And so Harry began funding Goddard, which was a bit of a risky thing considering the fact that he was just one scientist. Again, you know, causing a lot of bad headlines to befall him from firing his rockets off at the aunt's cabbage farm. They would again come down and start fires, there would be explosions, and neighbors would call the police, ambulances would be sent down. So this is the kind of coverage Goddard was getting at the time, not really the kind of coverage that he wanted, but it certainly got Harry's attention and Lindbergh's attention. So Goddard had gotten some initial funding through the Smithsonian and the Carnegie Institution, but it was Harry who stuck with Goddard for close to 10 years. And the results of Goddard's research was somewhere around 200 patents, many of which are still in use today. Goddard was the guy who was one of the pioneers behind the idea of liquid-fueled rockets as opposed to solid-fueled rockets. Multi-stage rockets was another concept of Goddard's very early on. Multi-stage rockets are still today sort of the basis that space vehicles are sent up. It was the basis for sending them to the moon. So, and today, of course, Goddard, if you look at the NASA website, Goddard is referred to as the father of modern rocketry. So, Harry made a pretty good bet with Robert Goddard, and he had a lot of help with Lindbergh. That's Harry on the left, with Lindbergh on the right, and Goddard in the middle. I would say that Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, with all due respect to them, Harry was really the original space investor, and the results kind of speak for themselves. There's another business that Harry was involved in, and I think this is an example of kind of taking a hobby and turning it into a real business, and that was horse racing. Harry started out with one horse in the 1930s, and then gradually built up his stables over time. He kept some of his horses here at Cane Boy, Daniel Island, and a lot of members of the Guggenheim family had raced horses or been involved in show jumping and this and that, but Harry kind of took it to the next level and hired the best trainers he could find. He hired the best jockeys he could find. But he learned an interesting lesson from the whole experience, particularly around by the time of the early 1950s. In 1951, he had a horse that he took to the Kentucky Derby. It was considered to be probably the best horse in the business at the time. And then naturally, Harry, being a person who hired only the best people, we had a man who was probably the best jockey in the business. So even with the best jockey and the best horse, he still wound up not even in the money. I think he came in sixth that year. And that did not deter him. 2 years later, he came back with another horse named Dark Star. And that Kentucky Derby was interesting because Dark Star was basically a 25-to-1 odds-on loser. Like nobody thought that horse was even going to place at any level in the winner's spot. There was I should say that one of the main reasons for the lack of confidence in Dark Star was the fact that Native Dancer, which was Albert Vanderbilt's horse, was racing in that derby as well. And Native Dancer was like a legendary horse. That horse had fan clubs all around the country. Children would write letters to Native Dancer, and they'd get back a letter with an autograph with a hoof print. And that horse was beloved by millions. And keep in mind, this is a time of sort of the golden age of horse racing on television. More people were watching horse races than watching baseball at that time. So everybody knew about Native Dancer, and including Harry. I don't think he thought he had any chance of winning the Derby in '53, but he did. And this is Harry with Dark Star after the race. Harry went on then to continue with a lot more success in the stables. He actually had the highest earning thoroughbred horse farm in 1959 in the United States. So again, that was a business, kind of turning a hobby into a real life business. And I've got a chapter on that in the book. I knew nothing about horse racing, and I still know nothing, but I really did a lot of research on the races, which was it was fun to. In particular, it was fun to see some of the alternative metrics that Harry came up with to judge his horses and to sort of train them and nudge them toward potential championship season. Alternative metrics, I think, in some ways was one of the calling cards of Harry Guggenheim's business strategy. There was another business that Harry got into that I don't think he ever imagined he would be in, but in 1939, Harry married Alicia Patterson, was his third wife, and Alicia was every bit Harry's match at every level, practically. I mean, she was a great hunter. She could fly fish. She was an incredibly talented aviator. She may have even been a better pilot than Harry. She'd won a whole number of speed races across the country. And Alicia was she was part of a very famous newspapering family, the Medill family. Her great-grandfather had been the editor of the Chicago Tribune, Mayor of Chicago, as well. Her father founded the Daily News in New York City, and she was hoping that someday she might wind up in a position of responsibility at her father's paper. So she wanted to buy a newspaper of her own, and right after she and Harry got married, they had their honeymoon at Robert Goddard's test site, which had been moved from the carriage farm out to New Mexico, which was great news for everybody in Massachusetts. But that's where they really discussed, Harry and Alicia really discussed the possibility of buying a newspaper so that she could get the experience of managing and editing a daily newspaper. And of course, I think from Harry's perspective, he also thought, well, this might just be a good project to keep my wife busy. But they did find a newspaper on Long Island. It was a defunct newspaper. They started it up again and called it Newsday. And Alicia did a heck of a job. She there's very few women editors at newspapers in those days, but she managed to make a real business out of it. Harry was actually running the business side of the newspaper, but Alicia was running the editorial side, and so she was hiring the writers, the journalists, the photographers, even the newspaper boys, and it grew like gangbusters. Partly because, and I guess I'll give Harry some credit for this, the business plan for Newsday recognized the changing realities of Long Island. Long Island was a place where a lot of GIs were coming to live after the war, and there were a huge number of aerospace companies out there. So it was kind of a growing bedroom community to New York City, and it only had a very few kind of local newspapers. So the idea with Newsday would be to kind of cobble together all these communities under a single newspaper. It was Alicia's idea to do it as a tabloid. That got a lot of blowback from her father, who had started his own tabloid, the Daily News in New York. But her father did not think a tabloid would work in suburban Long Island, but he was wrong. And so Alicia made a huge business out of Newsday. She won the Pulitzer, or the newspaper won the Pulitzer Prize in 1954. And right around that time, Alicia was pictured on the cover of Time magazine. You would have thought all of this would make Harry happy and proud. Well, that wasn't really the case, because in spite of all of Harry's success, he felt that Alicia rarely gave him any credit for Newsday, even though he had put up the money to buy the newspaper. He actually held a 51% controlling interest in the paper, and ran the business side of the operation. But Alicia felt like that was her newspaper, and so in public pronouncements and interviews, and in private, Alicia rarely gave Harry any credit, and that did not go over too well with Harry. And Newsday continued to be a source of friction between the two of them. There was also kind of this issue of how a newspaper should be led. I mean, Alicia believed that a newspaper should lead its readers, that a newspaper should provide news that you, the editors, think they should have, whereas Harry was much more into focus groups and taking polls, and he thought that, basically a newspaper should give people what they want. So there was that conflict as well. And on top of all of that, Alicia being a Democrat, Harry being a Republican, every presidential race that came along, you'd have two editorials, two editorial endorsements, one by Alicia, one by Harry, and that created some confusion in the mind of readers, which Harry did not like. So let me move to the next slide. And by the way, I'm sorry. sorry, this is Alicia in the newsroom at Newsday with Alan Hathaway on the far right. Alan Hathaway was a very talented editor. Robert Caro, who I mentioned earlier, Robert Caro, a lot of people consider to be the most talented biographer in America today. Caro got his start at Newsday, well, he'd actually worked at several New Jersey newspapers, but it was at Newsday, starting out on the rewrite desk, and then he began doing a whole series of stories on Robert Moses, and that turned into the Power Broker. There's another business that Harry was involved with, and this is yet another one that I think he probably had never imagined he would ever have anything to do with. But the Guggenheim Museum was really kind of in its earliest stages of conception in the late 1940s, and Uncle Solomon, Harry's Uncle Solomon, had this modern art collection. He wanted to basically institutionalize it in a museum of modern art. And Solomon's muse and sort of first curator of the museum was Hilla Ribe, who is this nice-looking young lady here. Hilla Ribe was in many ways a kind of a visionary who worked with Solomon. She identified many of these artists that today are sort of household names in modern art: Kandinsky, Chagall, Bauer, and these people. The work of these artists could be had for very cheap back then, and of course they are, Kandinsky in particular, with millions today. So Hilla Ribe was quite talented in kind of finding the game changers of the avant-garde painters and sort of sculptors of Europe, and she introduced them to Solomon. So Solomon had a lot of loyalty to her, and vice versa. But Solomon died just a short time after he appointed Harry to the board, and at that point, Frank Lloyd Wright had been chosen as the architect for a new permanent Guggenheim. The Guggenheim Museum at that point was housed in a former auto body showroom of some type, and so all the work was there, and it's been curated and managed by Hilla Ribe. Hilla Ribe had talent as a sort of art scout, but as a museum administrator, she left a few things that he desired. And the art community, the writers and people who covered art in New York and the Northeast and elsewhere, had a real problem with Hilla Ribe. Part of it was the way that she displayed art at the temporary Guggenheim. She would have incense burning, and you'd hear Bach playing in the background, and she would sort of mount the paintings very low to the floor, so you could sit back on these ottoman couches and look at this work and kind of contemplate them in this mystical way. And she also had a habit of showing her own work at this museum, which didn't seem to bother Solomon all that much, but again, the art critics of the day were not having it. And I think legitimately they pointed out that the Guggenheim Museum was run by a nonprofit foundation, and you do have some obligation as a nonprofit to follow certain norms related to the public interest. So in any case, the New York Times wrote a story about Hilla Ribe, and in it suggested that perhaps the Guggenheim should take their art collection and turn it over to an institution that knows how to curate art and knows how to run a museum. So this was slightly unbelievable to Harry. A lot of family members started calling him saying, "What are we going to do about this?" And Harry had been chosen to be chair of the Guggenheim Museum board, partly because these controversies were sort of becoming hotter and hotter. So I won't go into all the machinations, the details, but basically Harry got rid of Hilla, and he brought in a guy named James Sweeney, who was the second director of the Guggenheim, who helped kind of guide the museum to its completion. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, hated James Sweeney, the new director, so that was another relationship that Harry had to manage. The two of them James Sweeney, the director, Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, stepped on each other's toes all the time and threatened to quit several times. But in any case, Harry, I think, managed that relationship pretty well. And the Guggenheim then opened, well, this is the inside. I'm sure you see this photo and the completed Guggenheim, and then this for the Museum of Ice Cream. I don't know what the design that was for. But in any case, Harry made a number of decisions that I think helped to guide the museum into the future, but maybe one of the most important was a very simple decision involving the name of the museum. Under Hillary Bay, she had been calling the Museum of Non-Objective Art, which was sort of like saying it's a museum of not something. And so, in addition to showing Hill the door, he renamed the museum the Guggenheim, the Solomon R. Guggenheim, but he knew, and he said in much correspondence, various people he knew it would be known as the Guggenheim. Frank Lloyd Wright, by the way, also lobbied Harry for his own name of the museum, and called it the Archeseum, the Arc, which in the first letters of the word architect, because he felt that architecture was the true mother art, and so the museum should reflect that, but Harry had no interest in going with Wright's idea. So, in any case, in 1963, Alicia died, and at that point, Harry took over Newsday and ran all of its operations. This is a picture, by the way, of Harry with Juan Miró, the famous Spanish sculptor and painter. After Alicia died, he asked Miró to do a piece commemorating her death, so he commissioned this sculpture, which is behind the two of them there. That sculpture is actually at the Guggenheim today. And I have a few other people that Harry worked closely in those days. So this is a photograph with Harry and John Steinbeck. After Alicia died, he brought Steinbeck in as a writer for Newsday, as a contributor. Harry and Alicia had known the Steinbecks for many years, John Steinbeck and his wife, Elaine Steinbeck. But that was sort of some of the higher profile things that Harry did, brought in some bigger names. And probably the highest profile thing that he did for Newsday was to bring in Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers became the publisher of Newsday. This is a photograph of Harry in the middle with Moyers on the right and Robert F. Kennedy on the left. This was a kind of just a small welcoming luncheon for Moyers. I think he had it was about 1,000 people. It was a who's who of media and business and politics in New York. And I think Harry realized that you really needed a true newspaper person to kind of like guide Newsday into the future and to kind of make it as great as he thought it could be. So he brought Moyers in. Bill Moyers at the time was the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson, and he was the most visible face of the Johnson administration in those days. But he wanted to leave for various reasons, and so Harry brought him in. First couple of years went well. Moyers, I think, built on the success of what Alicia had done, and he did even more things for the paper that made it what literally became the most successful suburban newspaper in America. Unfortunately, Harry, at that point, he was near the end of his life, and he had had a couple of strokes, and these physical problems that Harry was enduring caused some psychological changes, and so he had a big falling out with Moyers, and actually wound up firing Bill Moyers. But Bill Moyers, years later, said he had two things to thank Harry Guggenheim for. One was for hiring him, and the second was for firing him. He said he was grateful for Harry in firing him because, of course, after that, Moyers went off and had an absolutely amazing career in broadcasting. Still does, 36 Emmys and counting. So, and Bill Moyers was a very helpful source in this book. particularly for these last few years of Harry's life and his around the newsday. I know I've mentioned a bunch of businesses, and I don't want to go into any more detail on the public service that Harry was involved with over the years, but I thought I would just mention the fact that he was a flyer in World War II and World War I and World War II. Was an aviator. Somehow talked his way onto getting on an aircraft carrier in the Sea of Japan, and when he was in his early 50s. He was also, as I think I mentioned, ambassador to Cuba for 4 years. He was chairman of the Crime Commission in New York City for several years. And I think one of the really important and lasting legacies of Harry Guggenheim was the foundation that he created. And that was started right here at King Hoy and Daniel Island. A lot of military brass that would come and do hunts with him, hunting and fishing. They, of course, would all have a few drinks at the end of the day, and then they would solve all the world's problems. But these were, like real military guys, like senior military leaders who had served for years and years. So anyway, Jimmy Doolittle, who was one of those folks, said to Harry, you've had a lot of discussion about wars, current wars, prior wars, how to stop wars. He said to Harry, you're the only one with any money around here. Why don't you start a foundation to sort of think about this and do something about this? So Harry did, called the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and it looks specifically at the root causes of violence in human society. Lately, its mandate has been kind of expanded into race and policing, mass shootings, hate speech on social media. So it covers a lot of ground. It's a big mandate for a modest-sized foundation. But like a lot of Harry's businesses and like the social impact investing that he did over the years, his thought was always about the future, businesses of tomorrow, businesses of the future. And I think the foundation is very much aligned in the same way, focusing on the future. So I think with that, I probably over time, but I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Just have a little bit of a parochial question, which is, when the Guggenheims acquired Daniel Island, Kanoy, was there any particular business purpose to that, or was it just a playground? Was there intention to create a place to hunt and fish?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because Harry, as a businessman, yes, he wanted Kanoy and Daniel Island as these beautiful areas that he could hunt and fish. But a very short time after he acquired these properties, he started a timber operation, and he did cattle raising, and he tried to. I think his idea was really to try to make the land pay for itself. He did get it at a very good price. I don't know exactly what he paid for Kanoy and then later the land here in Daniel Island, but having made the initial purchases in the middle or late 30s, I think you're still dealing with Depression era prices. So he no doubt got a very good deal on the land that he bought both in Kanoy and Daniel Island, and he did for most, if not all, the time that he had both properties. He did run businesses here that he attempted to try to basically break even or maybe do a little better on what he paid for them.
But it was nothing to do with phosphate mining or their original source of wealth, which was mining, yes?
No, I think he was aware of the fact that there were a couple of other Guggenheims who had land down here as hunting retreats. And so, in a sense, Harry was kind of late to the game. Even Alicia had her own hunting retreat, which was not in South Carolina, but it was out down in Georgia, in coastal Georgia. She had a much more modest kind of hunting lodge, which was maybe, I think it was like a one-story building made out of cypress, and she had maybe 2,000 acres, so much smaller than Cape Hoy and Daniel Island. But she had her own lodge that she would go off to, particularly as their relationship started to deteriorate. She spent more and more time in Georgia than she did in South Carolina.
Lindbergh and his comrades were very active in lobbying against our entry into World War II. What was Guggenheim's philosophy?
Good question.
Well, I hear the question. What was it?
Oh, sure. I think the question was, Lindbergh was very much against the U.S. getting into World War II in the years leading up to Fort Pearl Harbor. What was Harry's views on that? Okay. That's a great question. It's a complicated question because there's sort of two issues, I guess, in my mind. There was the question of Lindbergh's non-interventionism, and then there was the question of all the controversies that were created by Lindbergh's speeches that had anti-Semitic statements and had some very sort of edgy things to say about Jews in the United States. And the two of them kind of converged at a certain point. But, by the research that I did, I think Harry disagreed with Lindbergh pretty stridently on our getting into the war because he had made a lot of comments about the need for the U.S. to become more involved, particularly with Lend-Lease and Britain. He really wanted to help Britain in the lead up, actually just before Pearl Harbor. Lindbergh felt that Britain had absolutely no chance in a war against Germany. And, both Harry and Lindbergh were ardent anti-communists. But I think that Harry was a little more practical about the kind of issues related to that, whereas Lindbergh felt that Germany was the only kind of bulwark against the sort of Soviet, the menace of Soviet communism. So he felt that Germany should maintain their strength in Europe, and that helping those who would fight Germany would make Germany weaker, and therefore we would be, the risk would be higher of communism sort of taking over all of Europe at some point. That was before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, that conversation, at least the public conversation, ended the debate about non-interventionism and America First basically disbanded a short time after that. But just to circle back to the point of your question, in the lead up to the war, there was a kind of a diminution in the correspondence between Lindbergh and Harry, and at one point they weren't talking about the war at all. They would be talking about like dog kennels on Daniel Island, okay? Or they'd talk about the latest rocket launch with Robert Goddard. And I don't know if that's because they suspected their mail was being read, or whether these two kind of very cerebral characters just didn't want to talk about a difficult issue that they both knew that they had different positions on. So it's not really knowable exactly just exactly how stark a contrast there was between Lindbergh and Harry in the very short time before Pearl Harbor, but there definitely was some difference of opinion there.
Did he have any children?
The question was, did Harry have any children? Yes, he did. He had one child by his first wife, and he had two children by his second wife. He did not have any children with Alicia Patterson. I don't know whether they would have had children if Alicia had been able to have children. She was physically unable to get pregnant. Harry was 15, 16 years older than Alicia, so I'm not sure if that was ever on the table in their relationship. Alicia, she had nephews and nieces, and those kind of were like her children to her. One of her nieces, by the way, was the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. So Madeleine Albright actually knew Harry quite well because when she was a young girl, she and her husband at the time would come to Falaise and spend time with her uncle. I don't think Madeleine, oh no, actually, I'm thinking back to the guest book at Falaise. I actually think Madeleine Albright did visit Falaise and or Daniel Island at one point. But in any case, no, Harry had 3 kids with 2 prior wives, and Alicia did not have any children. No.
So,
Yes, sir.
the lodge or whatever it was at Cane Hoy where they met and they stayed when they came down, I gather there's no public access to that. I mean, they don't have a visitor center or anything like that. I don't know, I'm just curious where it is.
Yeah, no, it's used by the family, and I think the Cane Hoy guest book may actually still be in use, believe it or not. But, no, as far as I know, there is no public access to the lodge.
Where is it kind of geographically from here? Is it on out Plymouth Ferry Road? Is it way up there or?
Yeah, I think Beth, you probably would have a better idea than me. I know it's north of here.
It's off of Clements Ferry Road on the Cooper River side.
Okay.
So
Off of Clements Road on the
Yeah,
Cooper.
on the Cooper River side.
On the Cooper River side. Okay, yeah. So. Yes, ma'am.
I love your book to begin with, but Harry, like his father and grandfather, always seemed to bet on the next best thing, the next technological innovation. I wondered if he ever had any epic failures.
Well, that's another very interesting question. I think, there were times when he felt Goddard was failing, and so, and I didn't mention this, it's probably too much detail, but Harry kind of hedged his bets a little bit with Goddard, and he also invested in creating a research lab out at Caltech in Pasadena, California, and that program actually eventually became JPL, which created all the the bar standards, etc. So that was not a failure by any means, but it was certainly something that Harry felt was, basically Goddard wanted to work by himself and not collaborate with anyone else. So he would design his own fuel pumps, and Harry would say to Goddard, you could farm that out to someone, and it would really speed up your research. And Goddard was well aware of that, but he felt like he wanted to keep everything under his control and not have his secrets be stolen. I would say Harry's work on the Crime Commission, I'm not sure I wouldn't call it a failure exactly, but it was very tough to get your arms around the whole notion of using data in a highly sort of granular way to try to figure out crime patterns and crime trends in New York City, figure out who was being bribed and which courthouses were corrupt, which police precincts were corrupt. I think he bit off a lot to try to execute that mission of that organization, which was to basically lessen the effects of organized crime and corruption in New York City. So I would give Harry kind of a mixed record on that. There was another phase in Harry's life where, as I mentioned, he was ambassador to Cuba, and talk about bad luck. He went to Cuba right on the eve of the Cuban Revolution. He was ambassador for 4 years, trying to negotiate between these university groups and these other kind of rebel organizations who were trying to overthrow the Machado regime, but in the meantime representing the United States and being aligned with the Machado regime by definition. That was a very untenable position to be in. And at one point Charles Lindbergh actually sent Harry a pistol through the mail because he was afraid, he was going to get shot or maybe kidnapped or assassinated. It was a very dangerous time to be there, and I think Harry learned a lot about negotiating and facilitating with disparate, very difficult parties, but I'm not sure you could call that a success in any way because at the end of the day, Machado was overthrown, and Harry left. Harry left because it was a new presidential administration, so it's not like he left because everything fell apart and there was nothing left to do. But try as he might, I think it was a real reality check for Harry to be in this diplomatic position. He'd never been a diplomat before, but he had a lot of ideas about a career in public policy and maybe even running for office. So he managed to get himself appointed to being Cuban ambassador. And I think he was in for a lot more than he realized, and he did not go back to the diplomatic world after that. So if there's any one failure, quasi-failure, I think probably his Cuban years were something that did not go the way he thought it would.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'm so sorry. I know we're running over. Can you guys speak loud? We don't have a microphone, unfortunately, or whoever. Would you like to go, sir?
Did he have any relationship with Eddie Rickenbacker or the Boeing in the 30s or 40s?
Yeah, that's another great name in aviation, Rickenbacker. I believe there was correspondence with Rickenbacker, but there wasn't enough there that I felt that I could explore that would really make much of a difference. I know Harry dealt with a lot of people in the aviation world in that time, including Howard Hughes. But no, not that I know of. I don't know of any particular relationship that he developed with Rickenbacker in particular.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming.